Okay, back again. Let's finish International Trade Lecture 6. This is the last part. Let's talk a little bit about a quota. A quota is a numerical restriction on the quantity of a good that can be imported into a country. So there's a lot of different ways that a country imposing a quota could either give it away or maybe make some money off it, generate some revenue for the government. So one way they could do that is maybe they auction off the quota to foreign producers or the government of foreign producers. These would be more along the lines of something called a voluntary export restraint. So one reason that a government might want to do it that way is because it might make for a lot less in the way of tensions with their trading partners. In other words, if you slap a quota on the amount of a good coming in from a country, maybe that country will retaliate. But on the other hand, if you say, look, we'll give you or we'll sell you quota rights because if you need to import this good into the country under quota, you might be willing to pay for those quota rights. So if you were to do that, then they would be a lot less likely to retaliate because at least they could benefit. They would be the ones who'd be able to figure out which producers are going to get the quota, or maybe in the case of like auctioned off to foreign producers, yeah, they'd have to pay for the quota, but they could box out their competition that way. A quota could also be auctioned off to domestic importers of the good. Typically, when we talk about a quota, we're talking about the restriction happening when the good is coming into the country. So you could imagine a situation where in order to get quota, it wouldn't be just given to you first come, first serve. Maybe it would be sold at an auction. All the people who want to bring in this good have to, be willing to pay for it. And then finally, you could imagine a situation where the quota might be given or auctioned off to domestic producers of this good. Remember, if you're imposing a quota, it's to protect the domestic producers. And maybe what happens is every time somebody wants to import this good from another country or export this good to the United States from another country, they have to first go to the domestic producer of the good and get quota from them somehow. All right, so let's talk about what happens when there's a quota restriction. So again, we'll start off imagining that PW is the world price, the country is an importer. We'll imagine that at PW, QDS is domestic quantity supplied, right? We move up the supply curve until we get to PW, drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is domestic quantity supplied. And then we'll imagine that QDD is domestic quantity demanded, right? We go all the way down the demand curve until we encounter PW, and that happens over here, and then we drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is domestic quantity demanded. Well, if the government or a government is going to impose a quota, it's not happy with the amount that's being imported. So the imports without a quota at a price of PW is the difference between QDD, domestic quantity demanded, and QDS, domestic quantity supplied. So imagine that the people in the government feel that this should be the right amount of import. So it's sort of like, you have to imagine taking a water balloon and squeezing it. If you squeeze it in one direction, then it gets bigger in another direction. So imagine that this is the amount that they're going to allow in under quota. Why would that lead to a higher price? Well, if you're an importer of this good and you've gotten a hold of quota, whether you paid for it or not, maybe it was given away. You still know that you can sell your good for a higher price because there's not going to be as much of it in the domestic market. So people who get a hold of quota are going to sell their good at a higher price. How is this going to affect domestic consumers and producers? Well, domestic producers of the good now have to compete against PQ instead of PW, so they will move up the supply curve until they get to PQ. Now we drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this over here, QDS, parentheses, quota, close parentheses, is the new amount that domestic producers are going to be able to sell under the quota. All right, what about domestic consumers, buyers of the good? Well, they're going to see a price of PQ, so therefore they're going to move up the demand curve until they encounter PQ. Then what we'll do is we'll drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is the domestic quantity demanded with the quota. QDD, open parentheses, Q, close parentheses, is domestic quantity demanded. So in this way, the quota looks a lot like a tariff. It reduces the amount that's being imported, and it leads to a higher price. All right, what about using our friends consumer surplus and producer surplus to describe what's going on? So let me use an example. Imagine that we have, let's imagine that American beer producers are not happy with the amount of beer coming in from Mexico. Let's say a lot of people are now buying Mexican beer like Corona, Dos Equis, or I don't know, Modelo or whatever. And imagine that they've agitated for a quota, and imagine that the quota is going to be the difference again between domestic quantity supplied with the quota and domestic quantity demanded with the quota. PQ is the price over here. How is this going to affect consumer and producer surplus? Well, consumer surplus when the price was PW was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? 1 is this funky shape, 2 is this triangle, 3 is this trapezoid, 4 is this triangle, 5 is this rectangle, 6 is this triangle over here, and then domestic producer surplus when the price is PW is only area 7, this triangle here. So when they impose this quota, the price is going to go from PW to PQ. Domestic consumer surplus is now only going to be areas 1 and 2. That's the area below the demand curve and above the new price, which we're calling PQ. All right, what about domestic producer surplus in this country? Well, before it was 7. Now that the price has gone from PW to PQ, domestic producers are going to pick up 3. And you have to remember 3 used to belong to domestic consumers. All right, what about the other areas? Well, 4, in the quote example, 4 is a deadweight loss to the more efficient foreign producers because they're getting boxed out of the market by this quota. They're limiting the quantity of the good that can be imported. 6 is a deadweight loss to domestic consumers because now instead of paying PW, they have to pay PQ. So they're buying less and they're paying more. When it comes to how much money could be raised from a quota, it's a little bit different. If you can imagine that this quota is on, again, let's say Mexican beer, and let's say that the cost of producing a bottle of beer is down here. Maybe this is like a nickel. Why is that? Well, beer's not that expensive. I mean, if you think about it, you've got water, you've got barley, you've got hops. The most expensive part of the beer would be the bottle, right? So imagine that it costs, let's say, a nickel to produce beer, and if you can get your beer into the United States, you can sell it for $1. So then the question is how much, if you had to go out and buy quota, if you had to attend an auction where they're selling off quota, how much would you be willing to pay for this quota? And the answer is, if you were pushed, it would be the difference between the price that you could sell it at in the domestic market and the cost of production. So instead of quota revenue just being area 5, it could conceivably be area 5 and 8. So that's one of the reasons why, the big push in the post-war period to get countries to convert their quotas into tariffs. That was one of the reasons because quotas are really sneaky. I mean, if you know that, let's say you're paying, oh, I don't know, 25 cents more for a pair of socks because there's a 25-cent tariff on it, then you know what you're paying. But if there's a quota imposed on socks and it drives up the price by 25 cents, you'd have no idea that you're paying that because you don't know how much extra it's really costing you. So it's sneaky, and it's also a way for governments to conceivably raise even more money under a quota than they would under an equivalent tariff. All right, I'm not going to play this for you. In fact, I don't even know how this plays on Camtasia, but this is an interesting story about a tariff that was imposed on socks coming in from Honduras to protect the domestic sock industry, which was kind of situated in a place called Fort Payne, Alabama, and it talks about the process that goes behind that. It's political. It's nothing. They're not doing it for the sake of the economy. They're doing it because somebody's agitating, somebody's requesting this kind of a thing be imposed on the market. I highly recommend that you listen to it because it'll give you an idea of how maybe the world really works. Also, it happened at a time when the economy was doing much better. This is before the financial crisis. And so a lot of the people who lost their job in the sock industry because of a good economy were able to find even better paying jobs. So, which is one of the reasons why a lot of economists think it's very important to have a growing economy. So I'll let you guys listen to this. Voluntary export restraints. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mentioned before that back in the 1980s, we imposed a voluntary export restraint on cars coming in from Japan. So let me give you the setup to that. In 1980, Ronald Reagan got elected, and he won the car states. So what do I mean by the car states? Domestic car production in the United States at that time was concentrated in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. That's where a lot of the car factories are. Most of the car factories are for General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. But in when he was running again for re-election in 1984, of course, he wanted to win those states again, but the U.S. car industry was being hurt by a flood of cheaper Japanese cars. Back in those days, if you bought, let's say, a Toyota or a Nissan or a Honda, it was made in Japan. This is before Japanese car companies started building factories here in the United States to make those cars. In fact, this voluntary export restraint motivated them somewhat to do that, to start building factories in the U.S. So what happened as a result of this voluntary export restraint, economists went ahead and studied this. It increased the price of cars exported from Japan to the United States that came in under the restraint by 14%. Now, 14% is a pretty big number, especially when you're talking about a big ticket purchase like a car, right? Back in those days, I think, the average price of a new car was about $10,000. So if you add 14% to that, that's another $1,400 on top of that. It increased the price of cars produced by the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Why is that? Well, if you're watching the price of your competitors' cars rise by 14%, you've got two choices. You can either keep your prices the same and maybe try to steal market share away from them, or you could raise the price of your cars. I mean, if those cars are going up by 14%, you could probably raise the price of your cars by 10%. And that's exactly what they did. So much for market share. The other thing that happened was because the big three were selling their cars at a higher price, they were producing fewer of them, right? If you raise the price of your cars, fewer people are going to buy them. The good news, in a way, is that you have less cost as a result. So now your profits are likely to be higher. And it also changed the mix of cars that Japan exported to the United States. So again, before the voluntary export restraint in the early 1980s, all the cars that anybody bought that were like Nissans, Hondas, and Toyotas were made in Japan. What Japanese car makers decided to do was to move upmarket. So they said, "Look, if we're going to agree to sell fewer cars in the United States, why are we selling little econo boxes? Like a Nissan Sentra or a Toyota Camry or our Honda Accord. Why are we making those in Japan and then sending them to the U.S. under the voluntary export restraint?" They said, let's move up market. So Honda came up with a luxury brand, which is Acura. Nissan came out with its luxury brand, which was Infiniti, and Toyota came up with its luxury brand, which was Lexus. And what they decided to do was they decided to produce higher end cars in Japan that they'd sell in the United States under the voluntary export restraint, and then build factories in the United States to build the cheapy econo boxes like the Nissan Sentra and the Toyota Camry and those kind of cars. And it really helped. It actually made the Japanese car industry probably stronger because it motivated them to move up market, and they didn't lose market share as a result of this voluntary export restraint. So I don't think it worked out quite the way GM, Ford, and Chrysler thought it might. All right, so let's talk a little bit about arguments for trade. The infant industry argument goes something like this. You imagine that you're trying to develop an industry, so it's in its infant stages. It's very young. What do you do when you have an infant? You protect it. So the infant industry argument is, look, we're trying to develop this industry. We have to make sure that it captures enough of the domestic market to be viable on its own. So what we're going to do is we're going to restrict the amount of imports from other countries. Like this is an argument that actually was made by Lincoln, President Lincoln, back in the 1860s. They imposed a tariff on steel coming from the UK. The UK was at that time the biggest producer of steel, and the argument went like, look, we want to be an industrial country. We want to move from being an agricultural country to being an industrial country. The only way we're going to do that is to protect our infant industry, in this case, the steel industry, and once this industry is on its feet, we can remove the tariff. The reason economists in general don't like this argument is because oftentimes what happens is an industry that gets tariffs continues with those tariffs for a lot longer than it needs to. So in the case of steel, it wasn't until Kennedy came along 100 years later in 1960 that these tariffs on steel were removed and the American steel industry became more competitive. Another argument you might hear, you're hearing this from Trump, is protection of the industrial base or tomorrow's industry. Look, we are there are fewer people working in manufacturing today than there have in the past, but we are still producing more manufactured goods in the United States than we ever have. We probably have a sufficient industrial base. What's wound up happening though is that some countries specialize in certain things, certain manufactured goods. Other countries specialize in other manufactured goods, and it's not a case of we're being put out of business necessarily. Now, there's a lot of controversy if you've been following the news over China restricting or maybe stealing intellectual property that belongs to U.S. companies. That is something that is going on. That is something that's banned by the WTO. That's something that a lot of presidents going all the way back to Bush 43 have had a hard time dealing with. But I don't think our industrial base is being hollowed out, and we certainly are competitive still in tomorrow's industries. I mean, in the future, I think China is going to be much more competitive in higher tech products, but I don't think that the United States is going to lose its ability to produce high tech products. Another argument you heard, like in the late 1980s, early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, was that if we ever went to war with let's say Russia, and we're downsizing our defense industry, how are we going to be able to produce tanks and airplanes on a big scale? Well, the thing is, I think we have enough in the way of defense goods that we don't have to worry about that. And even the people at the Pentagon are not too worried about our ability to produce defense goods. It's usually made by some people trying to keep, some defense factory open a little bit longer. The anti-dumping argument, I mentioned in the first part of this lecture that Japan had accused American steelmakers accused Japanese steelmakers of dumping. Most of the time, when you hear when a dumping claim is filed with the WTO, it turns out not to be true because there's really no benefit to selling at less in cost. You're just going to lose more money. And in the case of steel, for example, there are so many steel makers around the world that if one country's steelmakers engaged in dumping to try to get a foreign market all to its own, it would have a hard time doing that because steel is made in India, steel is made in Brazil, steel is made in China now, steel is made in South Korea. So it would be really hard to lose money for a long amount of time because you're thinking that you're going to get the market all to yourself in the future. I don't think that's really feasible. The low foreign wage argument goes something like this. How can we in the United States produce products that are made in other countries by lower wage workers? So, for instance, here in the United States, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. I think we here in California, if you're making minimum wage, you get 12 bucks an hour. If you think about what people make in other countries, including China, it might be a factory worker in China might make as little as 5 bucks a day. And yes, even today in Mexico, I think the minimum wage is something along the line of $5 a day for certain products. So you start and the wage is just the start of it. I mean, if you think about the other benefits, I put benefits in quotes, that a U.S. company has to pay for its workers. Well, things like the employer share of Social Security, the employer share of unemployment insurance, the employer share of Medicaid, unemployment insurance, this, that, and the other thing. It really drives the wage up a lot higher than just that basic minimum wage. So people who talk about low foreign wages say, how can we compete in making things like textiles or inexpensive toys with a country like China, where the wage might be $5 a day, or Mexico, yeah, where the wage might be something, the minimum wage might be like $5 or $6 or $7 a day, and workers in the U.S. have to get 7.25 plus some other things on top of that. Well, economists would say we can't, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't try to do that. Countries that have low foreign wages should make the goods that are low value added, and countries that have higher wages should make the goods that are more higher value added. Foreign export subsidy. This is actually a problem. There are mechanisms under the WTO to address these, but unfortunately, they don't move very quickly. They, meaning the WTO, don't move very quickly. There have been a lot of complaints regarding countries subsidizing their exports, not just China, but China being the biggest case because they're the biggest exporter, and they seem to flout the rules. So I guess what I would say is there needs to be better enforcement of export subsidies. Another argument you might hear is saving domestic jobs. So that's probably a stronger argument in an economy that has a higher unemployment rate. But right now, in the U.S. economy anyway, the unemployment rate is down around 3.5%, 3.6%. That's pretty low. I don't think we can get the unemployment rate that much lower. So what jobs are there really to be saved from restricting trade with another country? Now, maybe wages might rise for U.S. workers, but you're not necessarily losing jobs because of imports anyway. Thanks a lot, folks. I'll get this posted as soon as I possibly can.